Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. On tonight, we have actually record-breaking numbers of you joining us from, I'm hoping, not just in the UK, but all around the world. So it would be lovely as the evening progresses if you could inform us as to maybe where you are, what the weather's like where you are. It's blowing a gale here at the moment down in Kent. So yes, do try and let us know a little bit about our audience tonight. That'd be lovely as we go along. So this is one of our library insights. We normally do this in a room in London in the Wellcome Collection, but here I am in my home in a hallway. My name is Danny. I'm the engagement officer for the Wellcome Library at Wellcome Collection. I am a white male with dark hair, red glasses, a blue patterned shirt, and I'm sitting in a hallway with a sort of white background and a couple of knickknacks on the wall. That's just to describe myself for anyone with visual impairment. I am delighted tonight to have Wendy Moore with us, who will be giving a talk on the Endell Street Military Hospital. But a little word of format before we get to that. So tonight we are going to have a talk with some slides by Wendy. We will invite questions and comments from you as we go through the evening. It'd be lovely to get some questions, so please do feel free, or any comments you'd like to make that we could read out at the end, and then we'll sort of wrap things up within the hour. Please, as we do have a moderator, but if you could kind of keep your comments and questions courteous and respectful to anyone else in the chat, that would be great. We're using Slido tonight as well as we go along. I think that's probably all the housekeeping. If you would like to join us in a little toast later, it doesn't have to be alcohol. I'm sure you can have water, milk, orange juice, a tipple of your choice, but we're going to be raising a glass to the heroines of Endell Street right at the end as we go, because it's an evening, work's finished, so it's time to sit back, relax and enjoy. I did remind Wendy a little while ago that we met at something called the Medical Journalists Awards, which I was surprised to see was in fact over 10 years ago here at the Wellcome Collection. And yes, she's been in and out of the library, well, before that, but ever since. She's a fantastic writer. I'm really delighted that we have resources that I know Wendy uses for aspects of many of her books. She's very well thought of and has a great style. And part of that, I think, comes from a journalistic background. So they're very, very accessible books. So if you're interested in any aspects of history of medicine coming to life, then please do check out Wendy's novels and books. So without further ado, then, I'm going to hand over to Wendy to do a little bit of introduction with Suffragette Surgeons of Endell Street. Over to you, Wendy.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Danny, for that lovely introduction. I will just describe myself briefly as well. I'm a white female. I've got gingerish hair. I'm actually wearing a purple shirt and green earrings in tribute to the suffragettes. And I'm sitting in my little room, which is cluttered with lots of books and pictures. So that's me. Well, it's fantastic to know there are so many people listening in. I really wish we were in the Wellcome Library to do this, but obviously we're in our own homes. And it's really particularly a thrill for me to be talking to you on behalf of the Wellcome Collection, and specifically the library, for two reasons. Firstly, as I have told Danny on several occasions, the Wellcome Library is my favourite library in the world. and I don't say that to all the libraries. But secondly, as I'm going to reveal, because it is the place where this particular story really began for me. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about the story of Endell Street Military Hospital and how I came to write it, and then I'm very happy to answer questions. We are living through extraordinary times at the moment, and the story that I'm going to talk about, I think, has got many parallels for us today. As Danny said, I'm a journalist by training, and I've written 5 non-fiction books which all tell remarkable stories from medical and social history. And often when I talk about my books, people want to know, how did I first come across the story? What was the inspiration for the book? And usually the answer is quite dull. There's no eureka moment. But with Endell Street, there really was a dramatic moment of discovery. Because some years ago, I walked into the Wellcome Library and I saw a picture on the wall. And Justin is going to show us the picture. Here it is. And I did a double take. Firstly, it's a huge and stunning picture, very beautiful picture by Francis Dodd. But secondly, it's rare enough today to see an operating theatre where all the doctors are female. So in this country, women currently make up about 48% of doctors. So we're nearly at the tipping point where women will become equal numbers in doctors and possibly even in a majority. But women are still underrepresented in many areas, including surgery. So in fact, currently 88% of surgeons in the UK are male. But then I discovered that this picture shows an operating theatre in the First World War in a hospital that was run and staffed by women, Endell Street Military Hospital. And I was amazed the hospital wasn't better known. And so I began a journey to try to bring that story to life. So second slide, please, Justin. Well, Endell Street was unique. It was the only military hospital under the auspices of the British Army to be run and staffed by women. And throughout the First World War, the women at Endell Street treated wounded men sent back from the front line. So from France, from Gallipoli, from every war zone. And the story of how the hospital came about is, I think, a remarkable example of courage and determination and stamina, which still speaks volumes to us today. So Justin, if we could have another picture. So when the war broke out in August 1914, thousands of men signed up to fight. And women signed up in their thousands too, as volunteers in every capacity. Women worked on the land, in factories, and on public transport, like this conductorette, as she was known, on a bus in the Strand. And naturally enough, women doctors volunteered too. So within 10 days of the war being declared, more than 60 women doctors had put their names forward to the War Office. But their help was bluntly rejected. One doctor, in fact, a Scottish surgeon who was called Elsie Ingalls, she volunteered her services to the War Office, and she was rebuffed with the words, "My good lady, go home and sit still." So Justin, another picture, please. Well, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson refused to sit still. They were both qualified doctors with more than 10 years experience each. So Louisa, who was 41 at the start of the war, was a surgeon. Flora, who was 4 years older, was a physician and anaesthetist. And they both originally trained at the London School of Medicine for Women, although Flora finished her degree at Durham University. But despite the fact that their qualifications were exactly equivalent to their male colleagues, as women doctors, they were only allowed to treat women and children. So women in the UK had won the right to qualify in medicine several decades earlier. And in fact, it was Louisa's mother, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who had been the first woman to qualify in Britain to join the medical register in 1865. But nearly 50 years later, at the start of the First World War, women were still confined to treating women and children. So by this point, there were roughly 1,000 women doctors in the UK. But the vast majority of them had qualified, like Flora and Louisa, at the London School of Medicine for Women, for the simple reason that most medical schools and all of the London medical schools did not admit women students. No jobs in the mainstream, the general hospitals, were awarded to female doctors because the all-male boards always appointed men. And women doctors were not normally allowed to treat men, even though, of course, nurses were treating men all the time. And women doctors rarely worked in surgery. So next picture, please, Justin. So Flora and Louisa worked in hospitals which had been set up and were run by women, treating only women and children. Louisa worked as a surgeon at the new Hospital for Women, which had been originally founded by her mother. That later became the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital, which was later subsumed into UCH, University College Hospital. Flora also worked in hospitals in South London, in fact, for women and children. And together, Flora and Louisa ran a small, very small, just 7-bed hospital for children in a poor area of London. So the picture on the left shows Flora in the middle there, in the middle of a very crowded outpatients department. Well, given the prejudice that they had both faced, it's scarcely surprising that they had both become suffragettes. Louisa served 4 weeks in Holloway Prison for smashing a window, and in the photograph you can see her actually on a suffragette march, marching with her mother. But Flora had taken what was even more daring action, really. She had been Emmeline Pankhurst's doctor and campaigned vociferously against the force feeding of suffragettes who were on hunger strike. So she actually treated many of the suffragettes for the ill effects of being force-fed at a nursing home that she ran. And she even helped some of them to evade justice, to evade being recaptured and sent back to prison. So in early 1914, just a few months before the war broke out, she was actually under police surveillance by Scotland Yard for her activities. And they were also life partners. Flora and Louisa were devoted to each other. They wore identical diamond rings and they lived together in the manner of a married couple. Flora described Louisa as my loving comrade. So they had stood shoulder to shoulder in the battle for the women's battle for equality. But when the war broke out, the suffragettes and the suffragists all suspended their campaign for the vote so that they could join the fight against the common enemy and help support the war effort. So Flora and Louisa were just as keen as any male doctor to serve their country and help treat the wounded. But they also saw the war as an opportunity. It was a chance to prove that women doctors were equal to their male colleagues. So they didn't waste time approaching the army. They knew they would be rejected. As active suffragettes, they were effectively public enemies. And instead, just 8 days after the war had broken out, they offered their services to the French Red Cross, who were more than happy to accept. And within a fortnight, they had raised £2,000, that's £200,000 roughly today, for equipment and medical supplies. They recruited a team of like-minded women and they kitted themselves out with military-style uniforms. And then on the 15th of September, so just 6 weeks after the start of the war, they set off with their team for France. So next picture, please. So they named their unit the Women's Hospital Corps. And in addition to Murray and Anderson, there were 3 more women doctors, and later another 2 joined them. 8 nurses, and more nurses also came out later, and 3 women orderlies. Plus they had 4 male helpers, male nurses. And when they arrived in Paris, they were given an empty luxury hotel, the Hotel Claridge in the Champs-Élysées. And in the picture, you can see them sitting on the steps in the internal courtyard of the hotel. It's actually still there if you've attempted to visit. It was brand new at the time, it had never opened, but within 48 hours, they had scrubbed the floors, set up camp beds, and converted the hotel into a 100-bed emergency hospital. So we think now that it's quite amazing that those Nightingale hospitals were set up within a few weeks, but this was done in 48 hours. So just in the next picture. So they turned the stylish salons and the dining rooms of the hotel into their wards. The ladies' cloakroom was converted into the operating theatre, and the grill room, which had been originally designed for wealthy guests to linger over claret and steaks, that became the mortuary. And then just 2 days after taking possession of Claridge's, the wounded began pouring in. So they were British and French soldiers from the front line, which was then roughly 60 miles north of Paris. And most of them needed urgent surgery. Well, as women doctors, they were, of course, extremely and even dangerously inexperienced. They had no experience of military surgery. They had very little experience of major surgery at all, and they had never previously treated men. But they learned fast, and in any case, the wounds and the conditions that they had to treat were unprecedented. So no doctors, male or female, had previously encountered the scale of casualties and the extent of the wounds that the First World War unleashed. So the men arrived with huge, gaping, ragged wounds. They had complex compound fractures where the broken bone fragments come through the skin. There were wounds from shrapnel, which had left dozens of fragments in bones and in muscles. And there were lots of head injuries until the army belatedly realised that it might be quite useful for the men to wear steel helmets. And even worse, most of the wounds had extensive gangrene, which was caused by the microbes that existed in the heavily manured soil of northern France. Some of the patients were already showing signs of shell shock too. So at first, the army officers and army doctors who came to visit the hospital to see this novelty of a hospital that was run by women, they were quite sceptical, and some of them even downright hostile. But when they toured the hospital and they saw the women at work and they spoke to the patients and they watched operations in the operating theatre, they were converted and they became allies and advocates for the women's work. So Justin, if you have the next picture. And then 2 months later, in November 1914, Flora and Louisa opened a second hospital in a small hotel, the Chateau Mauricien, at Wimereux, which is about 4 miles north of Boulogne. So the picture shows the hotel in rather more tranquil times. That's also still there if anyone's interested in visiting. And this time the army gave them official status. So they had rations and equipment which were provided by the army. So the Chateau Mauricien really became the first hospital staffed by women to operate under army auspices. And there they treated the wounded that came from the first Battle of Ypres, who were arriving daily in ambulance trains at Boulogne. And then in early 1915, Murray and Anderson were invited to a meeting at the War Office in London with Sir Alfred Keogh, who was the head of the Royal Army Medical Corps. So essentially he was the top doctor in the army. Keogh had heard about their work in France, heard it praised by his army colleagues there. He knew that he needed thousands more beds on the home front in London, in Britain. And so he now asked them to run a major military hospital in the heart of London. And it was an astonishing request, completely unprecedented. But they accepted immediately because they knew this was their big chance to prove that women doctors were every bit as skilled as their male colleagues. So they closed their units in France and they moved back to London. So Justin, if we have the next picture. So Endell Street Military Hospital opened in May 1915 in a former workhouse. It was St Giles and St George's Workhouse in Covent Garden. It had 520 beds. Later that was increased to 573 in 17 wards. And all of the wards were named after female saints. And it was, and it would remain, the only hospital within the British Army to be run and staffed by women. Apart from 22 male RAMC orderlies, and that number was later reduced to 8, all of its 180 staff were women. So there were 14 doctors, and that's 14 doctors' posts. Altogether, there were about 40 different women doctors who worked at Endell Street throughout the war, including surgeons, physicians, anaesthetists, radiologists, a pathologist, an ophthalmologist, and a dental surgeon. Most of the women doctors had also trained at the London School of Medicine for Women, although some of them actually came from overseas, specifically to work at Endell Street. Flora Murray was the chief physician, and she was the medical director, basically in charge of running the hospital, and Louisa Garrett Anderson was the chief surgeon. There were 29 qualified nurses, so really not very many to think of running 17 wards, and more than 80 women orderlies. And in fact, it was the orderlies who did most of the work. They were nursing assistants, stretcher bearers, cooks, cleaners, and clerks. And most of them were young, upper or middle class women who'd previously really led lives of leisure. Most of them had never boiled an egg before, let alone emptied a bedpan. And some of them were actually dropped off at the gates of Endell Street in the morning in chauffeured cars. But regardless of their background, all of the women wore the same Endell Street uniform. They were all awarded army pay and allowances, and they were given honorary military rank. So they were not officially in the army, but they were given rank equivalent to the posts they would have held if they'd been men. So Murray and Anderson became the equivalents of majors, and Murray was later promoted to be lieutenant colonel. So the next picture, please. So Endell Street was on the front line of the capital's wartime medical care. Ultimately, there would be more than 300 hospitals in London receiving wounded soldiers of all sizes. So they range from the major general hospitals to very little nursing homes. But Endell Street was one of the 20 largest military hospitals in the capital, and in central London it was one of the biggest 10. And because of its proximity to Charing Cross Station, where the wounded were arriving by ambulance train, it received the most serious cases. So the convoys of wounded usually arrived in the middle of the night, and the imminent arrival of a convoy would be announced by a bell ringing in the courtyard. And then the orderlies who were on duty, who actually lived on site, would hurriedly get dressed and then run down into the courtyard to stand to attention. Then the ambulances would roll in and the women would unload the wounded, as in the photograph that you can see. But Endell Street was really regarded as a huge gamble. When Sir Alfred Keogh came up with his plan, he was warned that it would be a failure. So army chiefs predicted the hospital would not survive 6 months. And in fact, the War Office put every obstacle in the women's way. They were actually as unhelpful as possible. And yet it not only survived 6 months, but was hailed a triumph. So to begin with, some of those wounded men who were brought there and unloaded in the courtyard were actually so shocked at arriving in a hospital run by women and being surrounded by women doctors that they thought they had been sent there to die, because that was the only explanation they could think of for arriving at a hospital that was run by women. But very quickly, they not only accepted the women staff and the women doctors, but they would then start telling their friends and their colleagues that it was the best hospital in London. And the newspapers responded likewise. At first, the press really treated Endell Street as a bit of a curiosity, and the earliest press reports were often quite frivolous or incredulous. But that soon changed, and there were loads of newspaper articles hailing Endell Street as an emblem of the Blighty fighting spirit. So the Suffragettes Hospital, as it became known, was described in headlines as the most popular and the most successful in London. So if we have the next picture, please, Justin. Endell Street became renowned for its efficient organisation and professional care. The staff treated more than 26,000 wounded throughout the war. So the vast majority of them were men, but there were also about 2,000 women who in the later years of the war worked in the services as the WACs and the Wrens and the RAFs. The doctors at Endell Street performed more than 7,000 major operations and many more minor ones. So often they were operating 8 or 9 hours a day. And they introduced pioneering treatments. So they were in the vanguard in championing X-rays and physiotherapy and occupational therapy, which were all novel specialties at the time. And they also pioneered a new method of wound treatment. In 1969, Louisa, Garrett Anderson and the Endell Street pathologist, Helen Chambers, trialled a new antiseptic ointment to tackle the severely infected wounds that they saw. So the ointment was called bismuth iodoform paraffin paste, or BIP for short. And they found that it not only healed wounds better than other antiseptics that were in use at the time, but because it could be left in place for up to 10 days, it meant there were much fewer dressings for the men. So that was much less painful for the soldiers, but also a lot less time consuming for the women. So they first tested BIP in July 1916 on some of the first wounded men who were sent back from the Somme, and they published their results in the Lancet a few months later. So we have the next picture, please. But Endell Street was also famous for its homely atmosphere, because Louisa, Garrett Anderson believed that the men were often more wounded in their minds than in their bodies. So she insisted that the wards were all airy and bright, with colourful bed quilts, armchairs, standard lamps and fresh flowers that came daily. The courtyard, which had originally been this very grim, dark exercise yard in the old workhouse, that was turned into a tranquil green haven with potted plants and striped umbrellas, where the men could sit and relax and enjoy the sun, or gather together for entertainments that were put on, like the bank holiday fete that you can see in the photograph. And then sometimes the men would be told they could invite their families along. So that's why there's a little girl in the foreground of that picture. There was also a library with 5,000 books in the picture you can see on the right, which was run by 2 women authors who were also suffragettes. And there was a theatre which staged hundreds of entertainments, including concerts, magic acts, and every Christmas there was a pantomime. So there were more than 1,000 entertainers that visited every year. And the men were also taught knitting and needlework to keep them occupied and to keep their minds busy. And some of their needlework actually still survives. Next picture, Justin. So the shoe bag that you can see on the left, that's believed to be a picture depicting Louisa Garrett Anderson walking her two dogs. So the two women had two dogs, black and white dogs, like the Scotch whisky dogs. And the picture on the right of the dovecot, that was embroidered by a man with one arm. So on the back there's a note to say that it was embroidered by Walter Elmy, E-L-M-Y, who'd had one arm amputated. And both of those were passed down in the Anderson family. But despite all these efforts at jollity and distracting everybody, it was obviously exhausting and grueling work for the women staff. Because on top of the long hours they worked, the women were coming under attack from air raids. So from 1915, there were Zeppelin raids in London. And some of those bombs fell very close to the hospital, including one huge bomb which actually fell down at the bottom of Endell Street and crashed right through an air raid shelter, killing lots of people. And as the war ground on, there were, of course, food shortages, and then rationing was introduced. But also, Murray and Anderson were very strict disciplinarians. They were hard taskmasters and demanded very high standards of their staff. They really had to be. They had to be as tough as their male counterparts in order to run an efficient military hospital. So many of the staff were really in awe of them. Some of them spoke of being actually afraid of them. One orderly said that they were told they had to be not only as good as men, but better. And yet, even though they could seem very austere, very severe, they really did look after their staff. They'd often send their doctors and their orderlies away for a weekend to recover to their country cottage in Penn in Buckinghamshire. And yet, even though it was exhausting and very grueling, it was obviously exhilarating work as well. And in fact, many of the women later spoke of their time at Endell Street as being the best time of their life. Because the women were enjoying the chance, often for the first time, to do something that they were good at and working together with other women for a common cause, proving they were as good as men. So next picture, please. Well, after the war ended, Endell Street stayed open for a further year to treat the victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. And really that was the darkest time for the staff, because throughout the war, the women had saved thousands of men from death and disability, but they were no match for this invisible enemy, the flu virus. And this was an era before antibiotics, so there was very little that they could do to combat the flu. So the pandemic caused between 50 million and 100 million deaths worldwide. And at the height of the second, the most lethal wave in November 1918, so that was the time of the armistice, nearly 30,000 people died in the UK in 1 week. And at Endell Street, more patients died per week of the flu than had died per week in the war. And of course it affected the staff as well. So 22 of the staff fell ill with the flu, and at least 4 of the women's staff died. And at one point, Flora Murray, who stayed completely steadfast throughout the war, emotionless almost, she now broke down in tears. But Endell Street also trialled new methods to prevent the virus spreading, which included the use of face masks, which were not in common use at the time, and segregating the wards, and putting screens between the beds. So next picture, please, Justin. So the doors of Endell Street finally closed in December 1919, so just over 100 years ago. And the war had changed everything and nothing. Women had won the vote. So in 1918, women over the age of 30 were given the vote. And the women at Endell Street had proved that women could run a military hospital just as well as men, that women doctors, that women surgeons were at least as skilled as their male counterparts. And yet the women doctors, all the hospital's women staff, were now expected to go back to exactly the same roles that they had done before. So medical schools, which had only survived during the war by admitting women students, they now closed their doors to women again. And mainstream hospitals, the general hospitals, which had also only managed to stay open during the war by recruiting women doctors, they now dismissed those women again and refused to appoint women doctors. So in fact, there's one woman doctor was appointed to a post at the London Hospital, the Royal London Hospital, but the men there, the male doctors, threatened to resign if she took up her post. So most of the doctors who had worked at Endell Street had to go back to treating only women and children, or work abroad in missions, or retire. And it was going to be many more decades before women in medicine won equality, in law at least. I think most women doctors today will tell you that there's still quite a long way to go yet. So next picture, please. Well, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson continued working in medicine for a few more years. And then their children's hospital closed for lack of funds, and they retired to the countryside. Flora died in 1923. I think she was really worn out and worn down by all her war work. She had a military-style funeral and the last post was played. And Louisa lived on alone for another 20 years. She actually worked in a casualty department in World War II, and then she died in 1943. And at that point, her name was added to Flora Murray's gravestone, which is in a churchyard in Penn. So Louisa was cremated, her ashes scattered, but her name was added to Flora's gravestone, along with an inscription. And despite all of their trials, all of their battles, the words say, "We have been gloriously happy." That always brings a bit of a tear to my eye. So the last picture, please. So my book is really a tribute to all the women who worked at Endell Street and all the men who were treated there. And I wrote it to give voice to them, but also because I think the story still speaks to us today. And especially today, even though I didn't know at the time when I was writing it, about the extremes of human endurance, of loss and pain and sacrifice, but also of courage and dedication and compassion, and the simple joy of being alive. So thank you, all of you, for listening. And of course, I'm very happy to answer questions. And if you do want to know more, of course, there are a lot more details, a lot more characters, a lot more stories in the book itself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wendy. Just an incredible story and wonderfully told. Thank you. I really appreciated, you could see your connection with the people that you wrote about. And yeah, nice to bring it round to, yes, I think we can all appreciate now how difficult these circumstances can be. And gosh, I have got my own question, but just while we sort of take a slight pause to let you gather yourself after that talk, I would like to say hello because we've got people joining us from all over the place. We have people from Barcelona, hi. Rickmansworth, hi to you. Berkshire. We also have people coming from Bristol, hello to you. Northern California and Bexley Heath, which is really nice. Oh, and
Nice
Spain,
to meet.
another one from Spain, Alicante. Hi, Alicante. So it's great that we've got loads of people here tonight that enjoyed that talk, and we have got some questions coming in. Be lovely to have some more questions if anyone would like to, or even just make a comment, because we've got some nice comments already. So just before I get to those, just on a sort of personal level, Wendy, I mean, what you were talking about, it just struck me was the contrasts. So many contrasts going on, so many almost like contradictions. You've got a luxury hotel in Paris, a sort of great romantic city, and the absolute unimaginable horrors of war that people haven't seen before. So you've got the horror, you've got this sort of incongruous, luxurious setting. You've got women who you would think would be embraced, anyone helping, but no, because of their gender, they are shunned and they're not offered the support. And yet they're inspirational in that they don't take no for an answer, and they really do push things. I didn't know about BIP. That's really interesting. These kind of innovations that get lost, don't they, in the sort of the bigger histories of the First World War. But it is such an extreme time, and then still not being able to vote. So they're respected enough and allowed to get to a certain level, but then it's like that's enough now. And I just wanted to ask you, when you went through writing the book, were there times, I mean, did you kind of at times were you like angry, or were you more kind of like just kind of not in awe, but kind of like respectful for the people and what they did?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I think I went through probably every emotion researching and writing the book. As you say, it is a story of extremes, isn't it? Because reading the letters some of these women wrote who worked there, and their diaries, and also obviously I read testaments by men and other women in the war. The incredible thing is, they were suffering such privation. So there were blackouts, there were rationing of food, they were under air raid attack, they were losing loved ones. Many of the women who worked at Endell Street lost brothers and friends in the war, and yet they did keep going, and they used humour and parties to distract themselves. So it's almost strange in a way that by day they were dealing with these incredibly wounded soldiers who'd had awful experiences, but they were constantly having concerts and visitors coming round and pantomimes. It's almost kind of surreal in some ways, I think.
Yeah, and it's also, I suppose, I really like the fact that they've got men there doing needlework and they still survive. It's testament to making something out of nothing, really. And I like the fact that you were talking, I mean, just making the place a little bit more homely, a little bit more, is also quite forward thinking as well, isn't it? Making something not just a place to recover, but giving those little touches that just make people connect a bit more with their surroundings. We've got some questions come in. Do bear with me while I struggle with the tech, while I just hold on to my laptop here. I do thank you for the comment from Margaret we got quite early on, saying, I strongly believe there's a need for a statue to represent the women involved and for them to have recognition. And she mentions Camden History Society could help with this, but I think we'd all be pretty supportive of a little bit more representation of these incredible figures that really don't get much otherwise. We have the nice comment from Jose here as well. Many times in our days, women still having not only to be good, they have to be the best to be respected in their jobs. Yes, it must be so difficult to yeah, just get past that that sort of first hurdle, but then to be doing a great job, but begrudgingly kind of got some kind of recognition. Oh, lovely to see the photo in Paris of my grandmother behind Louisa, Garrett Anderson. That's from Liz. Hi, Liz. Wow, it's lovely to have.
And who was Liz's grandmother? Do we know?
She doesn't say. She doesn't say.
Okay.
Perhaps she'll let us know. But wow, that's lovely. That's lovely to hear.
I mean, one of the great things about researching the book was that I got in touch with lots of relatives whose grandmothers and great aunts had worked at Endell Street, and also whose grandfathers and great uncles had been treated there. So that was just fantastic to to sort of hear from them.
Gosh. Oh, okay. So thank you so much for all the questions coming in. I'm just going to try and pick out as many as we can. Was Flora and Louisa's relationship controversial? Did anyone find out? That's from Rebecca.
Okay. Yeah, that is a really good question, and very interesting, really, because they lived together from before the war. They were, always together, so they were really very much a couple within the suffragette movement. Pictures together lots of the time, lived together in the hospital throughout the war, and yet nobody comments on their relationship at all. So none of the staff or the patients seem to think it's remarkable, and I think that's really because lesbianism was pretty much invisible. So it was commonplace for two single women to live together, and in particular two women doctors to live together. Because if women doctors got married, that meant they would then had to resign their jobs. So there was good reason not to get married. So obviously a lot of people thought it was just, a convenient, economic and, useful way to share a house together. So, yeah, it kind of was unremarked. Nobody seemed to think it was controversial at all.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to try and whiz through. Some are quite simple, some might need a bit more explanation. But is the Endell Street Hospital still standing?
Okay, well, no is the answer. The building itself was demolished eventually in the 1970s, and then there are now flats on the site, council flats. But there is a plaque there on the wall at the top of Endell Street. There's a plaque that commemorates Endell Street and the women who worked there.
And we just had a question about staff lists for Endell Street, not just the general Red Cross list. So are there staff lists?
Well, no, there's not a definitive list. There's no surviving records, army records of the hospital, or medical records of the hospital. I should mention Jenny and Geddes before me did a lot of research on the hospital. She's a member of the Anderson family, and so she found a lot of the names of the doctors and the women who worked there, and I've found more by extensive searches. So together we have got a list of a lot of people who worked there, but it's not definitive, no.
Oh, it's a nice comment here. I did a master's degree in medical humanities at King's College. For my dissertation, I looked at the role of women doctors in the suffrage movement and the part they played in World War One. Your books are remarkably useful for my research, so nice to know it's making an impact out there. This is some really complimentary thoughts here, so thank you for that. Oh, this was lovely. Yeah. I prepared BIP paste bandages in the 1970s, still used for packing wounds at the time.
Yeah, I think it's still in use today, actually. I think particularly in dental surgery and maxillofacial surgery. So they didn't invent it. It was actually another doctor in the war who invented the paste. And he tried it on some of his patients in a small hospital in northern England. But then he asked the women at Endell Street to conduct a larger trial on their patients. So that's what they did, and then published the results.
Fantastic. Would there have been similar women-run military hospitals operating in France and Germany, or was this particular to the UK?
Well, in fact, there were other women medical units. So the women at Endell Street, Flora and Louisa set up the first women's medical unit that went abroad. But the Scottish Women's Hospitals was founded by Elsie Ingalls. So she was the one who was told to go home and sit still, but she didn't sit still either. She set up the Scottish Women's Hospitals. They weren't Scottish particularly, they weren't all medical either, but they were really funded by the suffragist movement. So that was Flora and Louisa's hospital was really supported more by the suffragettes. And the Scottish Women's Hospitals ran several hospitals in France, about 4 in Serbia, several later in Russia. And there were other women as well who went abroad and ran hospitals as part of the kind of Red Cross movement. I don't know specifically about Germany, and I don't think the French army, they didn't have women doctors at all. So I think that it was particularly women from the UK.
I must just say hi to Liz, who's I think is the lady whose relative is in the background. She mentions that another place you might find interesting is the boardroom of the Royal Free, as none of the portraits of senior surgeons and physicians before about 1960 is of a man. The Free was only went mixed in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah,
so
well, in fact, the Royal Free Hospital was attached to the London School of Medicine for Women. So the women who trained at the London School of Medicine for Women then got their clinical training at the Royal Free Hospital. So it was the first London hospital general hospital to take on women doctors.
And she mentions who the relative is. Dr. Rosalie Jobson, later Lady Holmes.
Right. Okay. Yes, of course. I know of her. So please do get in touch, Liz, through my website and tell me more.
She says her only wiki entry is in German.
Oh, okay. Well, she definitely gets a mention in my book as well.
Someone says, what uniform was Flora Murray wearing in her portrait?
That is the one that they designed. So they designed a uniform for the women at Endell Street, initially for the Women's Hospital Corps and for the women at Endell Street. And it was a kind of grey, green, almost khaki colour. And in fact, one of the wonderful things that I did as part of the research was one of the women who worked at Endell Street, called Nina Last, her granddaughter kept her uniform, so that it still exists, and that's at the Women's Library. So I went along and actually got to see this uniform that one of the women wore at the hospital.
Oh, it is something to have the actual items, isn't it, in place there. So I can't remember the name, but someone did actually ask, are there any letters or diaries between, about their, the two doctors?
That's really interesting, because there are lots of letters and other material at the Women's Library. So the Garrett Anderson family, bequeathed letters and photographs to the Women's Library. So that's a really good resource for the book. Flora Murray herself, she collected a huge scrapbook of cuttings about the hospital because she was really determined to keep a record of it as a kind of, testament of what they had done. And Flora also wrote a book about running the hospital called Women as Army Surgeons. But to my frustration, there are no letters between the two women, which, talk none at all during the time they were at Endell Street, because obviously they were living together. They didn't need to write to each other. But no letters in which they, talk about how they feel about each other. So in a way, that's partly why I wanted to tell the story through the eyes of lots of other women who worked at Endell Street. It's not just about Flora and Louisa, it's about all the women who worked there. Yeah.
It's obviously gone down extremely well with the audience. People saying, have there ever been a film made about them? And someone saying that it would be a wonderful TV series, the story of the sort of Anderson family and all that sort of related activities. And,
there is a possibility that it might be a TV series, so I'll have to keep you all informed.
Wow. Oh, Wendy, I think we've kind of covered most the thrust of the questions. Some were sort of quite similar. So I do want to just thank everybody. Well, I just rest the laptop there for your contributions tonight. It has absolutely fascinating, Wendy. So thank you so much for giving us that insight into remarkable lives and stories that really deserve to be more broadly known there. Are there any closing sort of thoughts? Just having given that talk and heard the feedback and.
I suppose I think it is. I suppose what did come across to me, in the current experience we're having, that obviously they were there during the flu pandemic, and clearly that's what's happening. We're in a similar pandemic, but I think it was their experience of living through the war, and getting through it, and how they got through it, that perhaps resonated with me more in the last year or so. So obviously I didn't know that when I was writing it, but I suppose we've had more of experience of that kind of situation since then. But it's been, I'm so glad everyone's joined in and enjoyed it, and lovely. I wish I could see you all, but maybe next time in a real life, in the flesh meeting soon.
That would be lovely, wouldn't it? Yes, I do miss not seeing people. But thank you all for your messages and your questions. Really appreciate it. I suppose it's a look at the bright side. We've managed to reach, lots of different corners of the world, because it's an international story, really, isn't it? And I think the idea of the suffrage movement really touches on so many people's lives. The impact of that and these fantastic women. As we're sort of getting towards it, I'm very keen to grab this little drink. So perhaps if you're able, you want to grab whatever is your preference. I've made a little cocktail here. I'm calling the Suffragette surgeon. So perhaps we can just raise a glass to the fantastic women of Endell Street. Cheers.
Here's it.
Oh, that's gone down well. Thank you, Wendy. It's great to have you, and I'm sure you'll be back. I'll see you in future in and around the library in the core of London. And it would be lovely to have you back another time. So I think for now, I just want to thank the audience for a really fascinating story. And if anyone is interested, please do look out the book, available from all good bookshops and online, of course. And check out any other of Wendy's books, and also if you want to come into the library, we've all got copies there as well. But very timely, Wendy. What a forward-looking people, just so long ago, having so many innovations going on, paving the way. So thank you all tonight, and as we just reached the hour, thank you very much. Take care. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Thank you.